Next, I would like to introduce speakers of our first session, and Lenore and Manuel Blum. Many of you have known Lenore and Manuel, I think, so I don't have to introduce too much. They have been a great in terms of doing research, but they are also good friends of Steve and a collaborator, especially Lenore, in research. And so I'm, I knew Lenore and Manuel when I was at Berkeley during 1987, 90 for studying PhD with Dr. Smale. And they have been very friendly and supportive to me and also to other Steve students. And in the last 10 years, we have been also in more exchange, and especially Lenore and Steve also went into a new research field called Conscious Turing Machine. The field which Manuel had interest when he was like in child period, but didn't have time and to study that. And so 10 years ago, I think Manuel I was thinking, but Lenore very much supported Manuel to study the consciousness. And so I don't, because of time, so I just let Lenore and Manuel to tell us about their work in this exciting field.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you so much. And wow, what an act to follow. Judy, you're more than a stand-up comic. You should take Colbert's position now. I mean, there's a job opening there, and I think it's NBC, CBS, one of those. They have a... There's a job there for you. Okay, so happy birthday, Steve. I have a couple more pictures. This one is in Hong Kong, and if you can see Steve and Clara on the right, and that's their mom right next to Clara. And of course, there's Beata, Mike, Felipe, Teresa. And I'm not in it because I took the picture. So that's during our Hong Kong years. And here's a very iconic picture of the 4 authors of this book that we wrote when we were in Hong Kong. So that's when we were young and beautiful, but okay, we like that picture. And here I wanted to show you actually one of the first papers we wrote has a title manifesto. Where'd that come from? But that was in the journal that Leon actually was editor of. So it had a beautiful cover, and we had shown that the Mandelbrot set's undecidable, blah, 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 but we were able to have that really nice cover. And that was our manifesto for complexity and real computation, so before our book came out. And here's a picture that I don't know if anybody's seen. Do you recognize that? That's Steve right after he came back from the Marquesas. So Charles and Jules's husband, Wellington, is Julesa here? Julesa, you were there. We're on that trip to Marquesas, and this is my office in Berkeley at Evans, and Steve had come up, and somehow I had a camera there, so this is a picture when, I don't think that lasted very long, that beard. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today, and okay, so I'm going to try to talk fast so I get my part in before Manuel. What is consciousness, and can machines have it? And this is joint work with Manuel and Avram. And in about 2000, after Hong Kong, we had the good fortune to join the faculty of Carnegie Mellon and join our son who was on the faculty there. So in a way, we turned on its head the nepotism rules that had been so infused our life earlier. And the 3 of us were in the same university, the same school, the same department, the same group. And in fact, when we got there, I just want to say this, we were in this big building, 8 floors or 6 floors, 8 corridors, and our son was on the 4th floor in the first corridor. And somehow somebody decided it would be really nice to, here's his office, to put me on this side and Manuel on that side. And then what we got there, and our son had put on mom, dad arrows. But later on, he was given a corner office, and he said, it's okay if I move? We said, sure. Okay, anyway, this is joint work with Manuel and more recently with Avram, though he had contributed a lot of the ideas. Okay, so what is consciousness? Throughout the millennia, consciousness has been the purview of philosophers and theologians. And until about 35 years ago, the scientific study of consciousness was taboo. The scientific study. Now it is actively pursued also by cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists, AI researchers, physicists, and mathematicians. So what changed? Well, in 1990s, fMRI technology enabled neuroscientists to look at the brain when people were doing things non-invasively, so they could sort of start to see what was going on. So that happened. But also very importantly, in 1995, Francis Crick, who's Nobel Prize winner, of course, wrote this book, The Astonishing Hypothesis. And what he was advocating, what he started to work on, was advocating the scientific study, but also looking at neurocorrelates of consciousness. And then in the mid-90s, philosopher David Chalmers started talking about the hard problem. And so let me tell you what the hard problem is. So, well, let's start with the easy problem. So the easy problem, according to David Chalmers, of consciousness are those the easy problems of consciousness are those that seem directly susceptible to the standard methods of cognitive science, whereby a phenomenon is explained in terms of computational or neural mechanisms. And this is often called functional or access consciousness. We're going to call it conscious attention, this kind of consciousness. And then he says the hard problem, the really hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think and perceive, there is a whir of information processing, but there's also a subjective aspect, and that's often called subjective or phenomenal consciousness, and we're going to call it conscious awareness. So we look at these two kinds of consciousness. And a conscious awareness, or the subjective consciousness, is usually associated with the word qualia. The feeling is what it is like. So Thomas Nagel had this article in '74, the feeling of what it is like to be a bat. And many focus on what it feels like when you see red. So you often hear about what you feel like when you see red. That phenomena. And so many view the hard problem as needing a new kind of science to explain subjective consciousness. But we're viewing the hard problem as a challenge to show that subjective consciousness is computational. So that's our perspective. Here we're coming from the perspective also of theoretical computer science. So the Conscious Turing Machine, which I'll describe, is inspired in part by Alan Turing's simple yet powerful model of consciousness, the Turing machine of computation, his model of computation. And here we have a universal Turing machine, 23-state universal Turing machine that can compute any computable function in the sense that whatever you can compute in the cloud or a supercomputer, and in fact anything you can compute in the ChatGPT, you could presumably compute in this 23-state machine in terms of computation. Okay. But we're also inspired by cognitive neuroscientist Bernard Bahr's global workspace theory of consciousness. It's often called the theater model. Bernard Bahr's was here for many years at the Redwood Center, actually, where he did some of this work. Okay, and for Bahr's, this is what he says: consciousness is the activity of actors in a play performing on a stage of working or short-term memory. Okay, I'm an actor in short-term memory, and their audience is under observation by their performance is under observation by a huge audience of powerful unconscious processors, powerful unconscious, in long-term memory that are sitting in the dock. You guys are the long-term memory processors here. And the unconscious processors vie amongst themselves to get their script or their query information on stage to be then broadcast down. So when you ask a query, it gets on stage, it gets broadcast down. Okay, so here's an example I often use. of the theater model in action. And so many people have had this experience, maybe you have, I don't know. You're at a party and you see somebody you know. But for the life of you, you can't remember their name, right? And then, you're driving home, there's some things pop up, and then when you're home and it's too late to do anything, the name pops up. So the name, what's her name, comes up from one of your processors who's totally embarrassed that you don't remember her name, sends up a signal to the stage that gets broadcast. So another processor will recall when it gets to broadcast where you first met. Maybe you met when you were a graduate student at MIT. That goes up there, goes down, something about what she does. Oh, she's a mathematician also. And that gets broadcast down, and her name begins with N. That gets up there, and that gets broadcast down. And then an hour later, her name, Nancy, comes up. Nancy, there you are. I didn't really forget your name, but anyway, I was using that example, which has been thinking, searching. So, what's going on there? So every so often, one of these processors gives you some information that gets broadcast down, and more of the processes are working together, and finally you got her name. So the conscious self that's on stage is not privy to the workings of the unconscious self. Okay, so before I go into the definition of the conscious Turing machine, I want to say what it is not. It's not a standard Turing machine. So what gives CTM, conscious Turing machine, its feeling of consciousness is not its input-output map, nor its computing power, but what's under the hood and how it's working, and that's what I'll explain to you. And it's not a standard global workspace model. It's more of it's a formal mathematical model. So it's not just words, it's a mathematical model. It has a well-defined competition for the processors to get their information on stage, and I'll talk about that. And what's also interesting, it doesn't have a central executive. All the other kind of theoretical models has a central executive. This does not. And in fact, the competition works at that. It's making it a good model for AGI, and I'll say a few words about that later. And its subjective consciousness, its subjective feelings of consciousness will arise from another feature that's not in the global workspace models, and that's from the coevolution of brainish, which is CTM's self-generated multimodal, multisensory internal language and its model of the world, and I'll go into that. So finally, I just want to say it is not a model of the brain. It's way too simple for that, so it's not a model of the brain, okay? Okay, outline. So I'm going to give an overview of the CTM model, then I'm going to talk about these two notions of consciousness, conscious attention, which I said was like access consciousness, conscious awareness, which is more like aligned with the subjective notion. So those will be definitions within the CTM, okay? And then we'll talk about the coevolution of brainish and model of world, which is very important for conscious awareness. Okay, so what is the CTM? It's a 7-tuple STM, LTM, up tree, down tree links, input, output. Each of these are very formally defined. Time is measured in discrete clock ticks. We're going from 1 up to about 10 to the 10th clock ticks. CTM is born at time 0, and our machine has a finite lifetime t. And here's the description of all the pieces, which I will not give you, but I'll give you a sketch. So we start with a short-term memory, a small short-term memory. That's our stage. And on stage, it can hold one chunk of information. Now, it's not the 7 plus or minus 2 chunks that's talked about in cognitive neuroscience of George Miller, but we're looking for simplicity, and we can get away with one. So we're saying one chunk gets up on the stage. And then we have the audience, these long-term memory processors, very many of them. We are thinking we have about 10 million RAMs here. They're very powerful processors. They're not, at the first, they're not connected at all. They're totally independent. All processors in our model are in long-term memory. They, people with bells and whistles might want to put processors in other places because we're looking for simplicity. We're just assuming everything we need is down in long-term memory here, processors. Okay. They're unlinked at first. Okay, and built in at the beginning to all long-term processors, we have some predictive learning algorithms. These are called sleeping experts algorithm. This is where Avram Blum has really done huge contribution to this model of these algorithms for the long-term memory processes of learning algorithms. As I said, most of the processes, almost all of the processes are generic, but we do have some specialized processors. So we have input processors, which you might think of like sensory processors, and we might have output processors. We do have output processors, which you might think of that they're like motor processors, and they go to actuators, and the input processors come from sensors. And then we have gauge processors, and you can think of those like a fuel gauge, homeostats for the system. Okay, so those are our basic built-in processors, and everything else is generic. And each processor has its own internal language, but processors communicate within the CTM in a multimodal language, which we call Brainish. And what Brainish does is, it's not like English or Chinese, but it fuses a lot of modalities. So it fuses words, images, sounds, smells, sensations. So for example, in the model, the Brainish label for a rose might fuse the red color of the rose, the sweet smell, the soft touch of the petal. So that's what a Brainish word might be for labeling the rose. Okay, so how do processors get their information into short-term memory? So we have what we call this is the uptree part of the model, uptree competition, and each moment in time, each long-term memory processor puts a chunk into a leaf of a perfect binary uptree. Now, let me just say a couple words about this. In the literature, chunk is never formally defined. They'll say it's a phrase, it's a little bit of information. It could be a pointer to a poem, or when you say ABCD, there's a pointer to the ABC, and that goes on and on. So it's never formally defined. But we want to formally define it, so we do. Okay. So what's a chunk? So a chunk is a 4-tuple plus a little auxiliary information. It starts off with the address of the processor. So if there are 10 to the 7 processors, that's a 7-digit number. Okay, at the time, could be a 10-digit number, so not too long. We want these chunks to be fairly small, so when it does computation, it can do computation. The machine can do computation quickly. Then gist is succinct information in Brainish that the processor wants to get up into short-term memory. So you can think of the gist like a frame in a dream. When you have a dream, in one of the frames might have a photo, a picture, might have somebody talking. You might be feeling very afraid. It's a nightmare, whatever. It's fused. All of those modalities are fused in the frame, and that's what we sort of think of what the gist is, like a frame in a dream. It could be just a question like, what's your name? But it could be much richer than that. Then the weight is a valence number, plus or minus, and it's the importance value of the confidence that the processor gives its gist. And the auxiliary information is important for us for our uptree, and in this case, I'm just going to give you a little bit of auxiliary information, and we'll call that intensity. And what the intensity does, it starts off as the weight, absolute value of the weight the processor gives its gist. And so this competition, I say it's a little like a tennis tournament. Processors put chunks in, the neighbors play with each other, the winner goes up, and then the winners play with each other and they go up. So it's like a tournament. But what's happening as the chunk moves up, the first 4 parameters stay identically the same, but the auxiliary parameters change. And in fact, what happens is the intensity at each stage will change. And in our competition, which we call winner takes all, the intensity actually of the new chunk will be like the sum of the intensities of the last 2 chunks. So as the chunk is evolving up, it's actually gathering more and more information globally. So locally, it's gathering more and more global information. So let me tell you a little bit about the competition. We have a really, which we like, very simple competition that does what we want. Okay, when we started this, we really wanted to have a totally deterministic machine. That's what our goal was. But we couldn't really manage it simply. And here is where we had a bottleneck, because every time we were trying to get the properties we wanted for this competition, we had to put in a lot of stuff to make a lot of new ideas, a lot of new definitions, a lot of things. Until we decided, okay, let's put a little probability in. So what we did is at each node of this tree, we add what we call a coin flip neuron. And the coin flip neuron takes in two non-negative numbers and then produces A and B, and then we'll produce A with probability A over A plus B and B with 1 minus that probability, basically. And that'll determine what goes up the tree. So here, let me give you a little quick picture of the tournament. So we have 8 players here, so we just have 8 processors, and they're putting in a random set of chunks with these are the weights. This is the intensity of the weights, so they're absolute values here. These are all positive numbers, and the sum of the weights here is 31. So one would like this competition to have the property that, A would win with probability 3 over 31, and H would win with probability 6 over 31. You'd sort of like that to happen with those weights. And so what we do is, very nice, if we're going up here, if that's going to happen, the probability of H winning will be 6 over 2 plus 6 is 8, and so forth. But what we're going to do now is, I said the auxiliary information is going to be winner takes all. And so the new chunk that wins, so if H won with probability 6 over 8, then its new intensity will be 8. It's the winner takes all. Let's take the sum. And then going up the next level, same idea again. H will win at that level 8 over 14 plus 8, 8 over 22. And then we're going to let its auxiliary information, the winner take all, be 22, be the sum of the intensities in going up. So, and the probability winning at that next level is 22 over 31. So what's the probability of H winning? Well, it's the first probability over the second probability times the third probability, and you see that 8's cancel, the 22 cancels, and we end up with 6 over 31, which is exactly what we want. And so we've really just proved generally a theorem that the probability of winning doesn't depend on the process's location in the tournament, only on how the chunk's initial ranking or weight, if you think of it as ranking, compares with all the 10 million other competitors. Okay, so that's a very nice property because you're not going to see these processes in your cortical columns moving around as they have different weights. And when you build a machine, you don't want the processes moving around depending upon the weights they're giving their chunks. So this is very nice. It's independent. Probability of winning doesn't depend on the process's location in the tournament. Very nice. So a lot of people ask us, well, why don't we just calculate the probabilities at the start and we'll know who the winner is? And the reason for that is nobody knows what the probabilities are. There's 10 million processors. They're all distributed. There's not one central processor that knows the whole thing. None of them know. They only know some local information. They don't know anything else. And so this is a way to do it, the computation, without knowing any other information to start with. Okay, very good. Okay, so this well-defined decentralized winner-take-all competition replaces the need for a central executive. And you really don't want to have a central executive, especially if you want to build an artificial general intelligence thing, because your central intelligence will be biased, and it won't allow for participation of unexpected talent. So, for example, if some processor has a problem that it wants to solve, and it doesn't know who has the information to solve it, or the interest, or the time, or whatever. It puts that problem in with very high probability, with high intensity. That'll most likely get into a short-term memory. That'll be broadcast, and then some processor will see, I put in, does P equal NP? Other processors say, I don't know, but I'm going to use a different kind of mathematics than discrete mathematics to look at that problem. That sounds interesting. I like that problem. I'm going to do it. I'm going to put that information into short-term memory, get it down, and some other processor says, I'll work with you on that. And you get a lot of people who are interested and have the talents working together. Okay, that's a quick thing. So when the winner gets into short-term memory, that chunk, we call that CTM's conscious content. So it's on stage now, and it's immediately broadcast down to all long-term memory processors at that time. That's the down tree. And so now we have our first formal definition. Conscious attention in the CTM is the reception by all long-term memory processors of the global broadcasts of the conscious content. Okay, that's our definition. And immediately you can see this is a little bit of a formalization of the global workspace notion. So, you can see the dynamics of the what's her name scenario going on here. What's her name into here and not broadcast down. I met her at MIT, blah, 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 gets up there and whatever. This is access consciousness. And then there's something called the Libet effect, which you can also see here. The Libet effect is that we're sort of making decisions before we're conscious of it. Well, the winner here, if there are 2 to the h processors, the height is h, so the winner actually was put into the competition h plus 1 times before CTM paid conscious attention to it. So there's a little explanation, as a lot of things that happen with the CTM, which is kind of interesting to us, that at least at a high level, corresponds to what the neuroscientists are finding, okay? So built into the long-term memory processors, processors store all broadcasted chunks. So what's happening, we think of that as a global dictionary. Every processor is collecting all the broadcasted chunks, and we'll see why that's important in a little bit. There are triggers. If a broadcasted chunk has a very, very high weight, then all processes must inspect, and I'll talk about what inspection is soon. All processes, if it's negative high weight, all processes must try to reduce extreme negativity. So these are triggers that are built into our machine. Okay, at the beginning I said that processors were independent, but after a while, processors start to link together, and we have a Hebbian-like principle that processors have common interests start to link together. So what's her name? Processor asked that question will eventually probably link to the one that had the correct answer after a while. So the linkage is formed, and we're again, for simplicity, we might say unidirectional, but for simplicity, we're saying these bidirectional links are forming. Okay, and so what links do is they change slow conscious communication, which goes through short-term memory, into fast unconscious communication. So for example, when you learn to ride a bike, everything you do is very conscious going through. But after a while, when you've done a lot of practice and your muscles get accustomed, that's all being done unconsciously until maybe a truck gets up to you. Anyway, that's fast unconscious communication that's happening all the time. So turning slow conscious to fast unconscious is what links is helping do. And then finally, I want to say about CTM, it's not a brain in isolation. You can think of it as a robot with a CTM brain. So it does this, CTM interacts with its outside world. It has inputs coming from the external world through sensors, going to sensory inputs, processors, and it has outputs going from output processors to affect actuators, which can affect the outside world. Okay, and so we can already see there's something which we call predictive dynamics going on here, cycles of prediction, feedback, and learning. And a major goal for the CTM is that all predictions are as accurate as possible. And we can say processes make predictions when they turn raw sensory inputs into chunks. It's a kind of an analog to digital conversion, put chunks into the computation, send informational links, and transform chunks into raw outputs, so from digital to analog. And they get feedback from broadcast inputs and links. And learning correcting takes place within the processes themselves. And this is Blum's sleeping experts algorithm, which adjusts the weight. So, for example, if a processor puts a weight in that's very high and it gets into short-term memory, but it's a wrong answer. Suppose the answer was to what's her name? The name is Carol. Its sleeping expert algorithm will say, hey, you were too bold, you weren't right, how about cooling it, lower the weight the next time? But another one that might have put Nancy in, but that processor was a little too timid, didn't get its chunk into short-term memory, but later found out that it was right. Its short-term memory, its sleeping expert algorithm will say, hey, you were too timid, raise your weight. So that's essentially the idea behind the sleeping experts algorithm. Okay, so this is conscious attention, but why would a robot with a CTM brain feel conscious? Okay, we do have conscious attention now. Okay, and we start with an axiom: the simultaneous reception by all processes of broadcasted chunks evokes in CTM a unitary experience. So, okay, I'm not sure where I am now. So I'm going to go a little into Manuel's time, and then I have sorry, I will go into your time. We talked about this, so it's going to, okay. What? But I won't take it all, I promise. We'll go quickly now. So the reasonable of even this first definition lie in the phenomena associated with consciousness, the number of phenomena that associated with consciousness the model can exhibit, explain easily and naturally, and actually agree at a high level with the cognitive neuroscience literature. And I already mentioned the Libet effect. We've also looked at something called blindsight, people who think they're blind but can then maneuver. We looked at the CTM could experience blindsight in attentional blindness. And I'll mention one right now, which is called change blindness, just so you get an idea. So this change blindness, this is a very famous film that's used in lots of cognitive neuroscience classes or whatever. Here's a detective who comes into a room and sees he's a room in a mansion, and he sees this dead guy on the floor, yeah. And he starts interrogating everybody, interrogates the maid, and she said she was polishing the brass, and he interrogates the butler, and then interrogates the wife, and she says she was in the potting shed, putting her petunias out or something like that. And then immediately he says, Constable, arrest Lady Smiley. And everybody's surprised, and he says, well, you don't plant petunias until the spring. Okay, but what's more surprising here is look at the difference between the first frame in the film and the last frame. And if you're watching this film, this was the first frame and that was the last frame. And you can see everybody's the detective's coat's changed. The dead guy has changed his clothes, his knees up off the floor, huge changes in flowers, everything. But nobody notices it in the film. Partly the director's gone from the beginning to it cuts to the different people and then. Well, what's the explanation from the CTM? Why didn't the CTM see the changes? Well, the explanation we give, which is again aligned with the neuroscience one, is the gist is very small that gets into short-term memory, and it's the same gist at the beginning, at the end. The gist is there is a scene. The scene is the living room of a mansion with a butler, maid, and detective, and a man laid out on the floor. That completely describes both scenes. That's what you keep in your short-term memory, and so you're not looking at details in the short-term memory there, and it's not long enough to sort of detail things. Okay, so that's more for the first kind of attention, but how about the feelings, when you're in love or you see a rose or something? How or can the CTM experience these subjective feelings? And so attention is not all you need. People know about attention is not all you need. And it's the co-evolution of brainish and the model of world. Basically, attention is not all you need. It comes from the transformer large language model literature, but I'm just using it. Okay, co-evolution of brainish and the model of the world. So the model of the world maintains the model of the world processor. So we have a processor, which we call model of the world processor, maintains models of the world and of CTM in these worlds. And the model of the world processor is widely distributed. In fact, we think of it as part and parcel of all the processors. They're all acting as model of the world processor. And it creates these model of the worlds. It labels sketches in the models of the world with multimodal brainish gist, including sketches of actuators as self when the CTM constantly detects the actuators carrying out its request. So for example, here you have a baby who's, by a power of thought, is sort of learning about its left leg, and in its model world, that leg will be labeled self. Okay, and it may be looking to its right leg, and it hasn't quite been able to move it yet, so it hasn't labeled that yet. So that's what's sort of happening in the model of the world. And in the CTM, the newborn CTM starts out with a very foggy model of the world, and then it gets populated with things, and I'll just show you how. Remember, CTM's very first broadcasted chunk, so some processor P0 at time 0 put in a chunk, but didn't have a language, so it's just null there with some weight. And that will be the initial chunk that CTM got. And we'll call that chunk, the name of that chunk, we'll call it blob 0 and 0, blob 0 in English. So the name of that chunk will be the first, so we have this chunk here, which is like the meaning, and the name is just P00. Because when we're building up brainish, we don't want to have too much information. We just have a word. We want a short word. We don't know all the meaning of the word, which will be in the gist, which will be very long. So we just want that word. So the word is the first two components of the chunk there. Okay, and brainish words in general will be such pointers. And we think of that as the word and the chunk it's pointing to as the meaning. And shortly, a primal word for pain will be created. So we have our first brainish word, which is blob 0 in English, and the next brainish word will be a word for pain. So if you ever witness the birth of a newborn, everybody's anxious for that baby to cry. So why are they so happy when the baby cries? Well, what's going on is the oxygen gauge raises its concern for lack of O2 and submits to the competition. So think we have a gauge like this in CTM, a sequence of chunks having negatively valenced weights of increasingly high absolute value, okay? And it's like O2 scream needs O2, needs oxygen. These chunks win and are broadcast signaling increasing desperate scream, do something, do something. And remember, the processes are programmed that if something's very high negative weight, they have to do something to lower the weight, but they don't know what to do. It's just the beginning. So the arms and legs flail. You've seen that in the babies doing that, the infant pees and poos. And the vocal actuator screams and cries. And wow, that's enough to get the breath. The last one works, the cry opens the lungs, and the infant takes its first breath, and the oxygen gauge goes down, just as it should. Okay. So if P1 is the oxygen gauge, T1 is the time it put in a chunk that got broadcast with high negative weight, we'll call that word, P1, T1, pointing to that chunk as pain 1. Okay, that will be a primal word for pain. And brainish gist will be a string of brainish words, most 20 we're going to say, and already we have a little brainish gist. P00 is blob 0 in English, and P1, T1 is pain 1, and you might think of this little sequence as being blob 0 is in pain. That's our first thing. And as brainish words and labels continue to evolve and build on earlier ones, so when the infant CTM gets to be a toddler, skins its knee pain will turn into a little bit other kind of pain, so pain will evolve to skin knee pain. So that's how words kind of evolve here. So we'll formalize this by a brainish word is a pointer to a broadcasted chunk. That's our definition in general. Brainish gist is a sequence of brainish words. CTM inspects a broadcasted chunk whenever all processors simultaneous upon inception examine the chunk's content. They go and they look at the chunk, look at PT, gist, W, and unpack all the words that go into this gist G. So it looks at all the words, and then because they're words and they have stored all the chunks that they've gotten, so they can just look up from P prime, T prime, the meanings of those words, and that's how they unpack. So we're saying that unpacking a brainish word means retrieving its meaning and examining its components, and so it's recapturing its meaning. It's just in its way. Okay, so we have a new second axiom, and our second axiom basically talks about subjective experience. It says inspecting a primal broadcasted chunk is a primal subjective experience, and then when you build up and you evolve, that inspecting this built-up chunk is a fusion of the subjective experiences that you've already looked at and experienced beforehand. So it's a sort of like an inductive axiom. Okay. So now we're going to define conscious awareness to be both conscious attention and inspection. Okay. And this is what we're claiming, that the axioms say that conscious awareness evokes a unique unitary. So unique unitary is from the broadcast, and subjective experience is from the kind of really deep inspection that's going on here. Okay. And the CTM becomes consciously aware of more and more broadcasted chunks. The model world processors may call attention to this fact, and the word pointing to this broadcasted chunk that calls attention, that word will call it conscious aware or just conscious. That gets labeled, the CTM gets labeled conscious then in its model of the world. And so CTM will experience a fusion, and it will feel itself conscious. And this is kindred in spirit to neuroscientist Michael Graziano attention schema theory, and this notion of conscious awareness is also kindred in spirit to philosopher Daniel Dennet's view of consciousness. And if you really, want to comprehend the notion of the model of world, you can still see the consequences of mislabeling. And this is coming from, human experience. So Cotard syndrome is when people feel they're dead. So if the CTM, for some reason, labels itself dead, it's going to have the analogous of Cotard syndrome. There are people who have limbs that they don't feel are their own, and they really want to get amputated, and no doctor in the US will do it. They often go to Mexico or someplace to do it, and then they feel good. And what's happening there is their limb in their model of the world, or in our CTM can experience this too, if it's mislabeled, not self. On the other hand, the opposite thing is phantom limb syndrome. People sometimes have their limbs amputated for one reason or another, but they still feel it itching and they still feel pain because in their model of world, or in CTM's model of world, it's still labeled self. So that's what's going on. And delusional disorders, for example, when the CTM labels its best friend, spy or whatever. So these are kinds of things that are happening in our model of the world and can happen also in the CTM model of the world. Okay, so I'm just going to end by talking about the elephant in the room, and there are lots of elephants here, but one major elephant is that what does this have to do with notions of consciousness? Many people are studying consciousness, right? So there are a number of main theories of consciousness, and they look at different aspects of consciousness, and I've labeled here some of the major theories in this global workspace, which we're modeling, AUC, attention schema, predictive processing, embedded and active whatever, and extended mind, integrated information theory, evolutionary theories of consciousness. So there are a lot of theories here. And what we've done is gone through every single one of these theories and others, actually, and show that at the high level, the key principles of these theories are actually come out of the CTM. So that's one actually confirming thing for us, is that the major theories actually have an incarnation in the CTM. And there's another elephant in the room, which the the researchers actually question us about, because I don't know if you've been reading, but there's been a lot of controversy between the two major theories. The two major theories, the global workspace, and the other is called integrated information theory. And there's been a 5-year study funded by Templeton to see which one is correct. It was called I'm not sure what the competition is called, but anyway, has been this competition, and they got results last year, and nobody comes out top. But they're saying, well, how come your theory, aligns with both of them when they're really fighting with each other? And that's because we're not mapping any of these features to parts of the brain. So global workspace maps their theory to the front of the brain. And integrated information theory maps their theory to the back of the brain. And we're not mapping it to any part of the brain. We're just saying this fundamental integration information theory basically says consciousness has to be integrated. Well, we have this integration with the global broadcast. It has to have a lot of feedback. We have a lot of feedback. So we have that. And so we have these features here. Okay, and one thing, and I just 2 more minutes, Manuel. This is an article I just found last month. It came out, Neuron, Key Value Memory in the Brain by Samuel Gershman, Ila Fete, and Kazuki Ire, and they're computational neuroscientists at Harvard and MIT, and I actually know Ila. But so what they're doing, our goal, and this is what they say in their paper, is to connect the dots between conceptualization of memory retrieval in psychology, neuroscience, and machine learning. Central to this effort is the concept of key value memory, which we formulate. The basic idea is that inputs transfer into 2 distinct representations, keys and values. The keys represent memory addresses, whereas the value represents content. So remember our definition of brainish? Brainish words are pointed to broadcasted chunks. So brainish words are pointers to the broadcasted chunks, which is very analogous to the keys, the addresses, and the value memory content. And in that paper, they basically say that, we believe all the memory is really just stored in the brain, and it may be this retrieval process that may break down at points. So I was very happy to see that an analogous notion is, in a very good neuroscience paper that's trying to look at connection between transformers and the brain. Okay, and a couple of months ago, actually, neuroscientist Kevin Mitchell wrote a blog and now a paper on actually there are 45 questions here, they're embedded in 15, about what questions should a real theory of consciousness encompass. And we went through every single one of these questions from the light of the CTM and answered it at least within the CTM, okay? So you can look at it in our archive paper, which will be a chapter in the book. So our summary is a simple formal mathematical model of consciousness that is clearly buildable, at a high level exhibits and explains phenomena associated with human consciousness, aligns and integrates underlying principles of major theories of consciousness, addresses Kevin Mitchell's 45 questions. And so, conclusion, AI consciousness is inevitable. You can read it. And thank you.